Before today's election, meddling and spy poisoning accusations, there was the Cold War. And before that, though many casual observers of history may forget, there was the Great Game. In essence, it was the original geopolitics standoff between Russia and the West, when the British Empire, Washington's predecessor as the world's uninvited peacemaker, spent decades laying the foundations for many of today's conflicts in an effort to restrict Russia's influence in Central Asia and the Middle East. The long simmering undeclared war, with its fighting in Afghanistan, sectarian violence, political intrigue, and desperate hunt for oil, may seem like a very modern conflict, and that's because it truly was. Sean Stone sat down with researcher Tim Coles, author of recently released book Human Wrongs, to discuss how this history shapes some of the world's most critical issues today.
The time, Britain's main interest was India. So this is 19th century. India provided the UK with much of its resources, particularly textiles. And it was very important to keep supply lines, strategic supply lines open. So here's where Afghanistan came into the picture, because at the time, Afghanistan had a border with India. And so it was essential for Britain's imperial interest, the Khyber Pass, to keep this area open for the UK.
And to the present, certainly it seems that people talk about oil wars and natural gas around the Caspian Sea in particular. Do you think this is what plays a large role in the conflicts that we've seen, be it, for example, with Afghanistan, but even just in controlling and accessing those stands, all those stands in the former Soviet republics around the Caspian?
Oh, for sure. There are Institute of Strategic Studies papers in America which talk about the importance of Caspian energy. And particularly with Afghanistan, if you look at a map, it's right in the center of this geostrategic intrigue. So back in the 90s, even Iran was thinking of invading Afghanistan. That's how important it is strategically for countries in the region. And I think what the US, with British backing, is trying to do at the moment is to block China's efforts to create what people call the New Silk Road, which will be a trading route. And of course, within this trade route will be a nexus of gas and oil pipelines running to different countries. So there was plans, for example, for the US to run a pipeline from, I think it's Turkmenistan, down to Pakistan and then on to India. And this will prevent Iran from running a pipeline through Pakistan to provide India with energy, although Iran seems to be pushing ahead with that anyway, regardless of what the US wants. So in Western media, particularly even among left-wing liberal media, we just don't hear about these kind of geostrategic interests. It's all focusing on party politics or counterterrorism or whatever it may be, or the minutiae of particular operations, and the broader context, the importance of the economy and the dependence on fossil fuels is omitted from this sort of coverage.
Absolutely. And you spoke previously of the British support for the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, but some of the support may have been even more direct. Certainly the Niger documents, Yellow Cake documents from Niger, that basically were meant to be the smoking gun that Iraq was developing nuclear capabilities. This was basically British intelligence that was providing the information and essentially giving America the modus operandi, basically the motivation for invading Iraq. So, what was the British game there?
Well, Britain certainly has a long history in Iraq, and it dates back really to the 1820s when armed British trading ships were sailing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As geographers at the time put it, we were going to bring civilization to the sons of lawlessness, in their words, typical imperial mentality. And of course, with the dependence on oil, and Iraq has, I think, the second largest resources in the region, then Iraq became an ultimate prize, as the Foreign Office, as the British Foreign Office called it. They said it's vital for any country that wants to dominate the world. These were secret files which have been declassified and hardly reported anywhere. You know, Mark Curtis, a historian, he's documented it. Apart from that, you can hardly find any information about it. And so coming up to the present, 2003, with Tony Blair and George Bush, they concocted all sorts of ways of luring Saddam Hussein. One idea, for example, was to dress a warplane up in United Nations markings and fire on Iraqi targets, get Saddam Hussein to fire against the plane, claim that he had been attacking the United Nations, and use that as a pretext for the invasion. And this seemed to be a joint British and American plan, according to Philippe Sands, who's one of Britain's leading lawyers. He somehow obtained a copy of this plan. So that's just one example of the kind of fabrications that the British establishment think of in order to try and justify their not only imperialism but support for American imperialism. Then, of course, Britain supplied the bulk of the forces to occupy Basra in the south, which is a crucial port for oil and trade. And Britain also, as it would appear, supplied training for America's divide and conquer strategy, where Sunni and Shia were played off against the other Shia militias. I think were being trained to assassinate Sunnis, and this helped to sow chaos and death and destruction in Iraq.
And if we look across the board at the whole region, that's what's occurred basically from Iraq forth, and you look at the leaders, dictators, frankly, but Mubarak and Saddam, Assad, Gaddafi, all have been deposed, and yet they were all strikingly secular leaders, even if they may have been bloodthirsty dictators and corrupt, but at the end of the day, they solidified their countries around a secular ideology. We've seen in their overthrow and destabilization more religious fanaticism that's taken hold in these countries. So what is the point of that from the Anglo-American imperial perspective?
Well, Britain and America are fairly ecumenical in who they support. So Saudi Arabia, it's one of the most fanatic regimes, gets plenty of support. And as you mentioned, others like Gaddafi, Assad are secular. So it depends on the timing. One very interesting example is Gaddafi. So in the 1990s, the British MI6, they were sending money to jihadi groups to try and overthrow Gaddafi, particularly in the Benghazi area of Libya. When it became apparent that they would not be able to do this, eventually Britain switched to supporting Gaddafi again. So having trained his, or at least wired money to his opponents, the British SAS, Special Air Service, were then training Gaddafi's forces. Then the situation reversed again, because according to various statements in oil journals, and with Libya it's mostly about the oil, Gaddafi was not making reforms to the economy, meaning he wasn't allowing British, American, French corporations to come in and fully buy up the state. So at that point, Britain switched again and started training jihadis. All the while this was happening, and then the jihadis hijacked the Arab Spring and started trying to overthrow Gaddafi. All the while, MI6 had a plan to get Gaddafi out of the country if he agreed to certain conditions. We don't know what the conditions were because they haven't been released in court statements. So this just shows that Britain and America simply don't care. The elites of those countries who plan these wars, they don't care. They have no guiding moral principles, whether it's secular or not. But one of the real tragedies of this is that when you have secular dictators like, say, Mubarak in Egypt, you end up getting groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually provide social welfare to the population of Egypt, which they're being exploited, and they have high rates of unemployment. So they depend on these Islamic groups for support. And then these Islamic groups are demonized. Now it's, the alt-right media online, which is really fanatically anti-Muslim. But even in the mainstream media, we hear insinuations that these are terrorist groups or supporters of Islam. So when the Muslim Brotherhood candidate Morsi came to power briefly in Egypt, there was a kind of sigh of relief in certain sectors of the media when he was deposed by Sisi, who then went on to commit mass murder in Egypt.